a part of one of my favorite novels called Housekeeping. It's by Marilynne Robinson, and it was published in 1980. It was Marilynne Robinson's first novel. She was a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize that year, but she did win the PEN/Hemingway Award for Best First Novel. It was more than 20 years before she wrote her next novel or published her next novel, for which she did win the Pulitzer Prize. And that's called Gilead. And that was published in 2004. Her other novels came quickly in comparison to the distance between Housekeeping and Gilead. And they are Home in 2008, Lila in 2014, and later this year, she has another novel coming out called Jack. She also is an important teacher of writing in Iowa. So this story briefly is the story of two sisters, two girls, Ruth and Lucille, and they are haphazardly raised in a place called Fingerbone, which is a fictional place, probably Idaho, but it's never specified. And they're raised by a series of female relatives, a mother, a grandmother, then two elderly great aunts who are kind of ditzy and funny. And then their Aunt Sylvie, who is an eccentric in the extreme. And the two girls are so used to being abandoned by people that they've come to expect it. And through this novel, there's this sense of anticipation that people are going to disappear on them. So it's also a novel that's about the transitory nature of our world, and everything is transitory in Robinson's mind, from the landscape to architecture, but most importantly, people's relationships. And I'm going to just read the beginning of the novel that sets the scene and hope that it'll be enough to encourage you to read the rest of it. So again, the person who's telling the story is one of the two sisters. My name is Ruth. I grew up with my younger sister, Lucille, under the care of my grandmother, Mrs. Sylvia Foster, and when she died, of her sisters-in-law, Mrs. Lily and Nona Foster, and when they fled, of her daughter, Mrs. Sylvia Fisher. Through all these generations of elders, we lived in one house, my grandmother's house, built for her by her husband, Edmund Foster, an employee of the railroad who escaped this world years before I entered it. It was he who put us down in this unlikely place. He had grown up in the Middle West in a house dug out of the ground, with windows just at earth level and just at eye level, so that from without the house was a mere mound, no more than a human stronghold than a grave. And from within, the perfect horizontality of the world in that place foreshortened the view so severely that the horizon seemed to circumscribe the sod house and nothing more. So my grandfather began to read what he could find of travel literature, journals of expeditions to the mountains of Africa, to the Alps, the Andes, the Himalayas, the Rockies. He bought a box of colors and copied a magazine lithograph of a Japanese painting of Fujiyama. He painted many more mountains, none of them identifiable, if any of them were real. They were all suave cones or mounds, single or in heaps or clusters, green, brown, or white, depending on the season, but always snow-capped, these caps being pink, white, or gold, depending on the time of day. In one large painting, he had put a bell-shaped mountain in the very foreground and covered it with meticulously painted trees, each of which stood out at right angles to the ground, where it grew exactly as the nap stands out on folded plush. Every tree bore bright fruit, and showy birds nested in the boughs, and every fruit and bird was plumb with the warp of the earth. oversized beast, spotted and striped, could be seen running unimpeded up the right side and unhastened down the left. Whether the genius of this painting was ignorance or fancy, I could never decide. One spring, my grandfather quit his subterraneous house, walked to the railroad, and took a train west. He told the ticket agent that he wanted to go to the mountains, and the man arranged to have him put off here, which may not have been a malign joke or a joke at all, since there are mountains, uncountable mountains, and where there are not mountains, there are hills. The terrain on which the town itself is built is relatively level, having once belonged to a lake. It seems there was a time when the dimensions of things modified themselves, leaving a number of puzzling margins as between the mountains as they must have been and the mountains as they are now, or between the lake as it once was and the lake as it is now. Sometimes in the spring, the old lake will return. One will open a cellar door to wading boots floating tallowy soles up and planks and buckets bumping at the threshold, the stairway gone from sight after the second step. The earth will brim, the soil will become mud and then silty water, and the grass will stand in chill water to its tips. Our house was at the edge of town on a little hill, so we rarely had more than a black pool in our cellar, with a few skeletal insects skittering around on it. A narrow pond would form in the orchard, water clear as air covering grass and black leaves and fallen branches. All around it, black leaves and drenched grass and fallen branches, and on it, slight as an image in an eye, sky, clouds, trees, our hovering faces, and cold hands. My grandfather had a job with the railroad by the time he reached his stop. It seems he was befriended by a conductor of more than ordinary influence. The job was not an especially good one. He was a watchman, or perhaps a signalman. At any rate, he went to work at nightfall and walked around till dawn carrying a lamp. But he was a dutiful and industrious worker and bound to rise. In no more than a decade, he was supervising the loading and unloading of livestock and freight, and in another 6 years, he was assistant to the station master. He held this post for 2 years when, as he was returning from some business in Spokane, his mortal and professional careers ended in a spectacular derailment. Though it was reported in newspapers as far away as Denver and St. Paul, it was not, strictly speaking, spectacular because no one saw it happen. The disaster took place midway through a moonless night. The train, which was black and sleek and elegant and was called the Fireball, had pulled more than halfway across the bridge when the engine nosed over toward the lake, and then the rest of the train slid after it into the water like a weasel sliding off a rock. A porter and a waiter who were standing at the railing at the rear of the caboose discussing personal matters, they were distantly related, survived, but they were not really witnesses in any sense, for the equally sound reason that the darkness was impenetrable to any eye, and that they had been standing at the end of the train looking back. People came down to the water's edge carrying lamps. Most of them stood on the shore where in time they built a fire, but some of the taller boys and younger men walked out on the railroad bridge with ropes and lanterns. 2 or 3 covered themselves with black grease and tied themselves up in rope harnesses, and the others lowered them down into the water at the place where the porter and the waiter thought the train must have disappeared. After 2 minutes, timed on a stopwatch, the ropes were pulled in again and the divers walked stiff-legged up the pilings, were freed from their ropes and wrapped in blankets. The water was perilously cold. Till it was dawn, the divers swung down from the bridge and walked or were dragged up again. A suitcase, a seat cushion, and a lettuce were all they retrieved. Some of the divers remembered pushing past debris as they swam down into the water, but the debris must have sunk again or drifted away in the dark. By the time they stopped hoping to find passengers, there was nothing else to be saved. no relics but 3, and one of them perishable. They began to speculate that this was not, after all, the place where the train left the bridge. There were questions about how the train would move through the water. Would it sink like a stone despite its speed, or slide like an eel despite its weight? If it did leave the tracks here, perhaps it came to rest 100 feet ahead, or again, it might have rolled or slid when it struck bottom, since the bridge pilings were set in the crest of a chain of flooded hills, which on one side formed the wall of a broad valley. There was another chain of hills 20 miles north, some of them islands, and on the other side fell away in cliffs. Apparently, these hills were the bank of still another lake, and were made of some brittle stone which had been mined by the water and fallen sheerly away. If the train had gone over on the south side, the testimony of the porter and the waiter was that it had, but by this time they were credited very little, and had slid or rolled once or twice. It might have fallen again, farther and much longer. After a while, some of the younger boys came out on the bridge and began to jump off, at first cautiously, and then almost exuberantly, with a whoop of fear. When the sun rose, clouds soaked up the light like a stain. It became colder. The sun rose higher, and the sky grew bright as tin. The surface of the lake was very still. As the boys' feet struck the water, there was a slight sound of rupture. Fragments of transparent ice wobbled on the waves they made when the water was calm again, knitted themselves up like a bit of a reflection. One of the boys swam out 40 feet from the bridge and then down to the old lake, feeling his way down the wall, down the blind, breathless stone head first, and then pushing out from the foot. But the thought of where he was suddenly terrified him, and he leaped toward the air, brushing something with his leg as he did. He reached down and put his hand on a perfectly smooth surface, parallel to the bottom, but he thought 7 or 8 feet above it, a window. The train had landed on its side. He could not reach it a second time. The water bore him up, and he said only that smooth surface of all the things he touched was not overgrown or hovered about by a cloud of something loose like silt. This boy was an ingenious liar, a lonely boy with boundless desire to ingratiate himself. His story was neither believed nor disbelieved. By the time he had swum back to the bridge and was pulled up and had told the men there where he had been, the water was becoming dull and opaque like cooling wax. Shivers flew when a swimmer surfaced, and the membrane of ice that formed where the ice was torn looked new, glassy, and black. All the swimmers came in. By evening, the lake there had sealed itself over. This catastrophe left 3 new widows in Fingerbone, my mother and the wives of 2 elderly brothers who owned a dry goods store. These 2 old women had lived in Fingerbone 30 years or more, but they left, one to live with a married daughter in North Dakota, and the other to find any friends or kin in Sewickley, Pennsylvania, which she had left as a bride. They said they could no longer live by the lake. They said the wind smelled of it, and that they could taste it in the drinking water, and they could not abide the smell, the taste, or the sight of it. They did not wait for the memorial service and rearing of the commemorative stone, when scores of mourners and sightseers, led by 3 officers of the railroad, walked out on the bridge between handrails mounted for the occasion and dropped wreaths onto the ice. It is true that one is always aware of the lake in Fingerbone, or the deeps of the lake, the lightless, airless water below. When the ground is plowed in the spring, cut and laid open, what exhales from the furrows but that same sharp, watery smell. The wind is watery, and all the pumps and creeks and ditches smell of water, unalloyed by any other element. At the foundation is the old lake, which is smothered and nameless and altogether black. Then there is Fingerbone, the lake of charts and photographs, which is permeated by sunlight and sustains green life and innumerable fish and in which one can look down in the shadow of a dock and see stony, earthy bottom, more or less as one sees dry ground. And above that, the lake that rises in the spring and turns the grass dark and coarse as reeds, and above that, the water suspended in sunlight, sharp as the breath of an animal which brims inside this circle of mountains. It seems that my grandmother did not consider leaving. She had lived her whole life in Fingerbone, and though she never spoke of it, and no doubt seldom thought of it, she was a religious woman. That is to say, that she conceived of life as a road down which one traveled, an easy enough road through a broad country, and that one's destination was there from the very beginning, a measured distance away, standing in the ordinary light like some plain house where one went in and was greeted by respectable people and was shown to a room where everything one had ever lost or put aside was gathered together, waiting. She accepted the idea that at some time she and my grandfather would meet and take up their lives again without the worry of money in some milder climate. She hoped that he would somehow have acquired a little more stability and common sense. With him, this had so far not been an effective age, and she distrusted the idea of transfiguration. The bitter thing about his death, since she had a house and a pension and the children were almost grown, was that it seemed to her a kind of defection, not altogether unanticipated. How many times had she waked in the morning to find him gone? And sometimes for whole days he would walk around singing to himself in a thin voice and speak to her and his children as a very civil man would speak to strangers. And now he had vanished finally. When they were reunited, she hoped, he would be changed, substantially changed, but she did not set her heart on it. Musing thus, she set out upon her widowhood and became altogether as good a widow as she had been a wife. After their father's death, the girls hovered around her, watched everything she did, followed her through the house, got in the way. Molly was 16 that winter. Helen, my mother, was 15, and Sylvie was 13. When their mother sat down with her mending, they would settle themselves around her on the floor, trying to be comfortable, with their heads propped against her knees or her chair, restless as young children. They would pull fringe off the rug, pleat up her hem, pummel one another sometimes while they talked indolently about school or worked out the endless minor complaints and accusations that arose among them. After a while, they would turn on the radio and start brushing Sylvie's hair, which was light brown and heavy and hung down to her waist. The older girls were expert at building it into pompadours with ringlets at ear and nape. Sylvie crossed her legs at the ankle and read magazines. When she got sleepy, she would go off to her room and take a nap and come down to supper with her gorgeous hair rumpled and awry. Nothing could induce vanity in her. When supper time came, they would follow their mother into the kitchen, set the table, lift the lids off pans, and they would sit around the table and eat together. Molly and Helen fastidious, Sylvie with milk on her lip. Even then, in the bright kitchen with white curtains screening out the dark, their mother felt them leaning toward her, looking at her face and her hands. Never since they were small children had they clustered about her so, and never since then had she been so aware of the smell of their hair, their softness, breathiness, abruptness. It filled her with a strange elation, the same pleasure she had felt when any one of them, as a sucking child, had fastened her eyes on her face and reached for her other breast, her hair, her lips, hungry to touch, eager to be filled for a while and sleep. She had always known 1,000 ways to circle them all around with what must have seemed like grace. She knew 1,000 songs. Her bread was tender and her jelly was tart, and on rainy days she made cookies and applesauce. In the summer, she kept roses in a vase on the piano, huge, pungent roses, and when the blooms ripened and the petals fell, she put them in a tall Chinese jar with cloves and thyme and sticks of cinnamon. Her children slept on starched sheets under layers of quilts, and in the morning her curtains filled with light, the way sails fill with wind. Of course they pressed her and touched her as if she had just returned after an absence, not because they were afraid she would vanish as her father had done, but because his sudden vanishing had made them aware of her. When they had been married a little while, she concluded that love was half a longing of a kind that possession did nothing to mitigate. Once, while they were still childless, Edmund had found a pocket watch on the shore. The case and the crystal were undamaged, but the whole works were nearly consumed by rust. He opened the watch and emptied it, and where the face had been, he fitted a circle of paper on which he had painted 2 seahorses. He gave it to her as a pendant with a chain through it, but she hardly ever wore it because the chain was too short to allow her to look at the seahorses comfortably. She'd worried that it would be damaged on her belt or in her pocket. For perhaps a week, she carried the watch wherever she went, even across the room. And it was not because Edmund had made it for her or because the paintings were less vivid and awkward than his paintings usually were, but because the seahorses themselves were so arch, so antic and heraldic and armored in the husks of insects. It was the seahorses themselves that she wanted to see as soon as she took her eyes away, and that she wanted to see even when she was looking at them. The wanting never subsided until something, a quarrel, a visit, took her attention away. In the same way, her daughters would touch her and watch her and follow her for a while. Sometimes they cried out at night, small, thin cries that never woke them. The sound would stop as she started up the stairs, however softly, and when she reached their room, she would find them all quietly asleep. The source of the cry hiding in silence like a cricket. Just her coming was enough to still the creature. The years between her husband's death and her eldest daughter's leaving home were in fact years of almost perfect serenity. My grandfather had sometimes spoken of disappointment. With him gone, they were cut free from the troublesome possibility of success, recognition, advancement. They had no reason to look forward, nothing to regret. Their lives spun off the tilting world like a thread off a spindle. Breakfast time, supper time, lilac time, apple time. If heaven was to be this world purged of disaster and nuisance, if immortality was to be this life held in poise and arrest, and if this world purged and this life unconsuming could be thought of as world and life restored to their proper nature, it is no wonder that 5 serene, eventless years lulled my grandmother into forgetting what she never should have forgotten. 6 months before Molly left, she was already completely changed. She had become overtly religious. She practiced hymns on the piano and mailed fat letters to missionary societies in which she included accounts of her recent conversion and copies of 2 lengthy poems, one on the resurrection and another on the march of Christ's legions through the world. I have seen these poems. The second speaks very warmly of pagans and especially of missionaries. And then it's a quote. The angels come to roll away the stone that seals their tomb, end quote. Within 6 months, Molly had arranged to go to China to work for a missionary society. And even while Molly belabored the air with Beulah Land and Lord We Are Able, my mother, Helen, sat in the orchard talking softly and seriously to a certain Reginald Stone, our putative father. I have no memory of this man at all. I have seen photographs of him, both taken on the day of his second wedding. He was apparently a pale fellow with sleek black hair. He appears at ease in his dark suit. Clearly, he does not consider himself the subject of either photograph. In one, he is looking at my mother, who is speaking to Sylvie, whose back is to the camera. In the other, he appears to be grooming the dents in the crown of his hat, while my grandmother, Helen, and Sylvie stand beside him in a row, looking at the camera. 6 months after Molly left for San Francisco and thence the Orient, Helen had set up housekeeping in Seattle with this Stone, whom she had apparently married in Nevada. My grandmother, Sylvie said, was much offended by the elopement and the out-of-state marriage and wrote to tell Helen that she would never consider her genuinely married until she came home and was married again before her mother's eyes. Helen and her husband arrived by train with a trunk full of wedding clothes and with a box of cut flowers and champagne packed in dry ice. I have no reason to imagine that my mother and father were ever prosperous, so I must assume that they went to some trouble to salve my grandmother's feelings. And yet, according to Sylvie, they did not spend 24 hours in Fingerbone. Relations must have mended somewhat, however, because a few weeks later, Sylvie, in a new coat and hat and shoes, with her mother's best gloves and handbag and valise, left for Seattle by train to visit her married sister. Sylvie had a snapshot of herself waving from the door of the coach, sleek and young and proper. As far as I know, Sylvie only came home once to stand where Helen had stood in my grandmother's garden and marry someone named Fisher. Apparently, no snapshots were made of this event. One year, my grandmother had 3 quiet daughters, and the next year, the house was empty. Her girls were quiet, she must have thought, because the customs and habits of their lives had almost relieved them of the need for speech. Sylvie took her coffee with 2 lumps of sugar. Helen liked her toast dark, and Molly took hers without butter. These things were known. Molly changed the bed. Sylvie peeled the vegetables. Helen washed the dishes. These things were settled. Now and then, Molly searched Sylvie's rooms for unreturned library books. Occasionally, Helen made a batch of cookies. It was Sylvie who brought in bouquets of flowers. This perfect quiet had settled into their house after the death of their father. That event had troubled the very medium of their lives. Time and air and sunlight both bore wave and wave of shock until all the shock was spent, and time and space and light grew still again, and nothing seemed to tremble, and nothing seemed to lean. The disaster had fallen out of sight like the train itself, and if the calm that followed it was not greater than the calm that came before it, it had seemed so, and the dear ordinary had healed as seamlessly as an image on water. Excuse me for a minute. One day, my grandmother must have carried out a basket of sheets to hang in the spring sunlight, wearing her widow's black, performing the rituals of the ordinary as an act of faith. Say there were 2 or 3 inches of hard old snow on the ground, with earth here and there oozing through the broken places, and that there was warmth in the sunlight when the wind did not blow it all away. And say she stooped breathlessly in her corset to lift up a sodden sheet by its hem, and say that when she had pinned 3 corners to the lines, it began to billow and leap in her hands, to flutter and tremble and to glare with light, and that the throes of the thing were as gleeful and strong as if a spirit were dancing in its cerements. That wind, she would say, because it pushed the skirts of her coat against her legs and made strands of her hair fly. It came down the lake, and it smelled sweetly of snow and rankly of melting snow, and it called to mind the small, scarce, stemmy flowers that she and Edmund would walk half a day to pick, though in another day they would all be wilted. Sometimes Edmund would carry buckets and a trowel and lift them, earth and all, and bring them home to plant, and they would die. They were rare things and grew out of ants' nests and bear dung and the flesh of perished animals. She and Edmund would climb until they were wet with sweat. Horseflies followed them, and the wind chilled them. Where the snow receded, they might see the ruins of a porcupine, teeth here, tail there. The wind would be sour with stale snow and death and pine pitch and wildflowers. In a month, those flowers would bloom. In a month, all dormant life and arrested decay would begin again. In a month, she would not mourn, because in that season, it had never seemed to her that they were married. She and the silent Methodist Edmund, who wore a necktie and suspenders even to hunt wildflowers, and who remembered just where they grew from year to year, and who dipped his handkerchief in a puddle to wrap the stems, and who put out his elbow to help her over the steep, stony places with a wordless and impersonal courtesy she did not resent, because she had never really wished to feel married to anyone. She sometimes imagined a rather dark man with crude stripes painted on his face and a sunken belly and a hide fastened around his loins and bones dangling from his ears and clay and claws and fangs and bones and feathers and sinews and hide ornamenting his arms and waist and throat and ankles. But his whole body a boast that he was more alarming than all the death whose trophies he wore. Edmund was like that, a little. The rising of the spring stirred a serious, mystical excitement in him and made him forgetful of her. He would pick up eggshells, a bird's wing, a jawbone, the ashy fragment of a wasp's nest. He would peer in each of them with the most absolute attention and then put them in his pockets where he kept his jackknife and loose change. He would peer at them as if he could read them and pocket them as if he could own them. This is death in my hand. This is ruin in my breast pocket where I keep my reading glasses. At such times, he was as forgetful of her as he was of his suspenders and his Methodism, but all the same, it was then that she loved him best, as a soul all unaccompanied like her own. So the wind that billowed her sheets, an announcement to her of resurrection of the ordinary. Soon the skunk cabbage would come up, and the cidery smell would rise in the orchard, and the girls would wash and starch and iron their cotton dresses. And every evening would bring its familiar strangeness, and crickets would sing the whole night long under her windows, and in every part of the black wilderness that stretched away from Fingerbone on every side. And she would feel that sharp loneliness that she felt every long evening since she was a child. It was the kind of loneliness that made clocks seem slow and loud and made voices sound like voices across water. Old women she had known, first her grandmother and then her mother, rocked on their porches in the evening and sang sad songs and did not wish to be spoken to. And now, to comfort herself, my grandmother would not reflect on the unkindness of her children or of children in general. She had noticed many times, always, that her girls' faces were soft and serious and inward and still when she looked at them, just as they had been when they were small children, just as they were now when they were sleeping. If a friend was in the room, her daughters would watch his face or her face intently and tease or soothe or banter, and any one of them could gauge and respond to the finest change of expression or tone, even Sylvie, if she chose to. But it did not occur to them to suit their words and manners to her looks, and she did not want them to. In fact, she was often prompted or restrained by the thoughts of saving this unconsciousness of theirs. She was then a magisterial woman, not only because of her height and her large, sharp face, not only because of her upbringing, but also because it suited her purpose to be what she seemed to be, so that her children would never be startled or surprised, and to take on all the postures and vestments of matron, to differentiate her life from theirs, so that her children would never feel intruded upon. Her love for them was utter and equal, her government of them generous and absolute. She was as constant as daylight, and she would be unremarked as daylight, just to watch the calm inwardness of their faces. What was it like? One evening, one summer, she went out to the garden. The earth in Rose was light and soft as cinders, pale clay yellow, and the trees and plants were ripe, ordinary green, and full of comfortable rustlings. And above the pale earth and bright trees, the sky was the dark blue of ashes. As she knelt in the rose, she heard the hollyhocks thump against the shed wall. She felt the hair lifted from her neck by a swift, watery wind, and she saw the trees fill with wind and heard their trunks creak like masts. She burrowed her hand under a potato plant and felt gingerly for the new potatoes in their dry net of roots, smooth as eggs. She put them in her apron and walked back to the house thinking, what have I seen? What have I seen? The earth and the sky and the garden, not as they always are. And she saw her daughter's faces not as they always were, or as other people's were, and she was quiet and aloof and watchful, not to startle the strangeness away. She had never taught them to be kind to her. I'm going to stop there and read one more small passage, if I could find it. And the next passage is the one that starts the book, the real story. A total of 7.5 years passed between Helen's leaving Fingerbone and her returning, and Helen is the mother of the two girls. And when she finally did return, it was on a Sunday morning when she knew my mother would not be at home. Oops. Excuse me. When she knew my mother would not be at home, and she stayed only long enough to settle Lucille and me on the bench in the screened porch with a box of graham crackers to prevent conflict and restlessness. And then she drove away, and that's where the real story begins of the two girls. Does anyone have any comments about it? There's some chat. Okay. No?
Julie, have you read the other books of this author?
Yes, I have. So the next book that was published was in 2000, I think I said 4. It's called Gilead, and it's the story of a man who's a congregational minister, as his father had been and his grandfather had been, in a small town in Iowa. And it's about he's looking back on his life. And I think it's also a beautiful book.
Well, her description was just exquisite. And did you say it was 1958 when this was written?
No, this was written in 1980.
1980.
Yes.
And that's the time frame of the
time frame of the book is very hard to pinpoint.
Okay.
There are very few clues in the book about the time frame, but I think it's from the 1950s. So this part is earlier. So this, where the grandmother is remembering her life, that's earlier. But the story of the two girls is basically from the 1940s and 50s.
Okay. Yeah.
And for example, there's one point in the book she mentions that one of the girls is reading a certain novel, and that book was published in the 50s. So nothing about, what was going on in the world or the Depression or the war, anything is there at all.
Well, that's what I thought was so interesting. It really was just about the day-to-day feelings of their life, all of the ordinary things that people do every day. And yet she was able to describe that so vividly. And you could see this. You could see them, going about their day-to-day. And so, I'm not surprised that she won awards for her books, because her description, and to be able to describe something as mundane as what she had described in the kind of detail that she did was really, I thought, really quite amazing.
Well, I'm glad you liked it. Her next novel, Gilead, was one of President Obama's favorite books. And there's, and he said he started reading it because it was about Iowa, and he was spending a lot of time in Iowa campaigning. And there is available an interview that he does with her, He interviews her.
Oh.
And so if you go on YouTube, you can find it.
So what attracted you to her in the first place? Did you just find this by chance, or you?
Trying to remember. I've read this novel twice. Once, maybe when it came out, and once just last year, I read it again. And what I liked about it was the idea that the landscape was really important to the novel and where people were, and at the same time they were kind of disconnected from it. I can't explain it clearly. The whole novel has this water imagery in it, and you feel you can really imagine what it must be like to be in that landscape with the lake and everything being damp all the time and smelling the water. I thought it was, I really think it's one of the best books I ever read. So I guess as all great literature, you can't describe it in just a few words.
No.
So.
But thank you. It was I think it was a great choice, as all of the books have been, and they've all been different.
So, Julie, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Do you have a sense of why the book was called Housekeeping as you read the book?
Yeah.
When I think of housekeeping, I think of the mundane task of polishing and vacuuming. Is there a somewhat of an abstract meaning here?
I don't want to give too much away, and I think there's a double meaning in the title of the book. But the mundane that you describe, the everyday tasks of taking care of a house and living in a house, let's just say it deteriorates in the course of the novel. So remember, I said at the beginning that these girls end up being raised by a series of different women. Well, at the beginning, you hear from the grandmother that when they're with the grandmother after they've been abandoned by their mother, they are sleeping in a house with a woman who irons the sheets and makes quilts and makes applesauce. And when she dies, these kind of ditzy elderly aunts take over, and they're totally uncomfortable in the role. And they pretty quickly give over the role of watching these girls to the Aunt Sylvie, who's the one who comes back to town. And Aunt Sylvie, I don't want to tell you everything about her, but she had spent some time on the road as kind of a vagrant. And housekeeping changes a lot under Aunt Sylvie. She starts collecting newspapers and bringing them into the house, tin cans, and all those things. So there is this sense that housekeeping deteriorates. But also, I think in the book there's a second meaning, and it has to do with houses, keeping you in a place. This widow didn't think about leaving. She had a house and she stayed there, and was a place for her family to come back to. And that kind of permanency also deteriorates in the book. So, and I should say, what it is the story of two sisters, and they take very different paths. When they're teenagers, they make different decisions about how they're going to lead their lives. And one of the girls follows kind of this family trait of restlessness and wanting to move away, and the other goes a more traditional course, and the town becomes more involved in their lives. It's a good story.
So this is like a presidential news conference. I'd like to ask a second question, please.
Go right ahead.
Are there any important male characters in the book?
Not important. the grandfather is kind of important because he gets to Fingerbone, and he goes off the rail on the bridge. But you know, he's a memory, as are the husbands of two of the women. Not important.
Does anybody else in the audience have any questions that they'd like to ask?
I don't think so.
I will just say that I've read a couple of Marilynne's books, and in fact, I'm reading Gilead right now.
You are.
Right, I read it a while back when it was first published, and I find her, you know, there's a spirituality to her writing.
Yes.
There's a real depth, although one may think she's writing about very simple
Right.
matters.
Right.
They're not simple.
Yeah. She's a serious Christian. And
Yes, yes, yes.
and it's important. There are important themes in her work.
Yes, really the essence of all of us, who we are. Gilead is wonderful. I'm only halfway through again, but it's the preacher who's telling his story.
Mm-hmm. And the new book that's coming out is about Jack, who's one of the young, who leaves the town, who leaves Ames in a scandal, and it's about his life.
Yes, it's about real people.
Yes.
These are genuine folks who make up the fabric of America, whom she writes about. Yes.
Right. I think she's a wonderful writer. I'm looking forward to reading the next novel, which is coming out, I think, in September.
Right.
So.
Exactly.
Which you can read again and again. It's really interesting. I told my daughter that I was going to read from this book for a group, and she said, "Oh, the best novel ever written."
Right.
I was kind of surprised because I don't think we'd ever discussed it, and yet we both have. I mean, I don't know. I would say it's the best novel ever written because I don't tend to speak that way. But it was interesting that we both liked it so much, admired the work so much.
Right. It's
Well, it sounds like we're lucky to have this author continue to write. She seems that her books are just wonderful.
Yes, they are. They're special. Yeah. And they're books you can reread.
yes.
Which isn't always true, because in so many books, once you've got the plot,
Right.
once you know the story, it's not worth rereading. But these you can go back to again and again, and you can even read passages and find them rich.
Because in a sense, I don't want to say there is no plot, but there maybe isn't a plot. It's a story.
Well, Barbara, did you read this? Have you read this novel?
I have read Housekeeping. I have to read it again. I read it a while ago. I have 4 of her books upstairs on my bookshelf. So I've known of her and for years. And in fact, this is an aside, but I think in the most recent issue of the New York Review of Books, she has an article, she's really writing about, I'm going to say, the state of affairs in America.
Oh, interesting. I'll have to look for that.
Yeah, it's in this week or last week's New York Review of Books.
Thank you.
So she writes, she's a philosopher.
Yes.
She is a philosopher.
But also, she's a really important teacher at the Iowa Writers Workshop.
Oh, okay.
And people really admire her for her teaching.
Well, yes. So
So,
she's a real gift to all of us.
right. I should also mention, for anybody who doesn't think they can get to the book, that this was made into a movie.
Oh.
And I think it's a Canadian movie from maybe the mid 80s. And Christine Lottie
Oh, wow.
plays Aunt Sylvie. And it's actually quite a delightful movie. I mean, a good movie. So if you can't,
Did they keep the name Housekeeping?
it's called Housekeeping, yeah.
So
If you can't do the book, try the movie.
you can do the Google and find
Yeah.
it.
Right.
Any other questions? Well, it's interesting, Julie, but the Penn's Village Reads for everybody on Thursday, 2 days from now, is another selection about two sisters.
I saw that.
Yeah. So I must say that we tried to pick a theme where we got a lot of women to read and a lot of women to pick. And it's been such a pleasure to see the selections that have, and the introductions to books that, I didn't know of. So thank you very much for the read, and thank you for taking the time. And everybody, we'll hope to see you again. And Julie Williams, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you all for listening.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.